All right, guys. So following on from a post I put up in the Bricks Facebook community yesterday, where I was working on this idea for a project for a client, where we have a container. In this case, it is a section. I'm calling it a view container. And we've got some controls here, which is actually a radio group inputs. And if we click on those, we can change the way our grid is viewed. So this is not a tab. With tabs, what you're doing is hiding and showing elements. This is a single grid, and all we're doing is changing the way that grid is displayed. We're not hiding one version of the grid and showing another version of the grid. If we did that, we're just going to increase our DOM by having 3 different versions of the same information. So this way here, it's a single grid on the DOM, and we're just changing how it actually lays out by changing some of the grid properties. That's what I wanted to do, and this is what we've achieved here. So just a very quick intro as to how this all relates to each other is we've got a section which is containing all of this, and for my JavaScript that's going to control this and my CSS that's going to control this, I'm referring to this as my view container. Okay, and it's actually a section, and it's going to be used as what I call my view container. The switcher sets the data view mode attribute on that element, depending on which one you click. So what we end up with is on that section, we end up with data view mode being either list, grid, or small grid. Then we can then use this as a CSS targeting rule to decide how we're going to display the elements within this section. So we can have multiple grids within this section. So you might have, 2 columns with different grids in them and one controller, and that controller will switch all of those at the same time because they're within that view container. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're going to then look at the DOM structure for the switch, the DOM structure for the grid, for the main grid, and then also the layout of the cards, because we also use this to affect how the card is laying out, which we'll talk about. We're going to talk about a problem with FireFox with using this method that I've used and how we will have to overcome that. And just very quickly on the FireFox issue, I'm just going to show you in FireFox, it all works exactly the same, except for we don't get the label icon here changing color because you can't target it. And the reason is because the way we've structured our inputs, our radio inputs, with the CSS, we're using the has selector, and Firefox does not have the has selector. So we need to restructure the way we do these inputs so that we can use CSS that works in both. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So the first thing we're going to look at is the structure of these radio groups. So let's look at the DOM for that. So in the DOM, I've got a UL or an unordered list, and on that I've got a data target container attribute which is set to main view wrapper, and that is the ID that I've given to this section that's containing all of these elements. Okay, and I'm going to use that for targeting it for my JavaScript, and then we use the CSS from that to target how we lay things out. All right, we'll come back to that a little bit later. And then I've got my first LI. Screen leader is going to get to this. It's going to go, okay, I've got a list. I've got 3 items. First item is this. Now, looking at this, I probably need to put an ARIA label on it, which I haven't done, to say that this is for the list view, grid view, and small grid view. So that's something I've omitted to do here, but I would then go back to this and put an ARIA label on whichever one. I'm not sure if we need to put it on the input or we would put it on the LI. We'll have to work that out a little bit later. But that, for accessibility, that's something I overlooked just as I'm looking at this here. Now, so we've got an LI, and on that LI we've got a label, and then we've got an input. And the reason I've done this is if we go label wrapping the input, which is a radio input, we don't have to link the label to the input using IDs. So we can reuse this in another section without having to worry about IDs, which is why I've done it this way. Unfortunately, because we can't check for the focus or the inside here, we can't check for focus in there and then set the color of the label based on whether there's focus in there. we can't do this for Firefox. So we have to use another way of linking the label to the import, which is putting an ID on the import and then using the for attribute on the label, which we're going to do later when we show you how to make this work with Firefox as well as Chrome. Okay, so that's the structure there. So a UL, LI, in those LI we've got a label, we've actually got an icon using theme icons, I think, yes, for my icon here. And then we're using an input, which is a radio with the name of view mode and a value of list in this case. Then the next one down would be a input with exactly the same name, because that links them together as a radio group, but my value is grid. So when I click on the grid, I want to pull this value and I want to stick that into my data view mode up here. So that's the goal of what we want to do here, okay? And then obviously there's the third input, which is exactly the same. Look at that, same name, so it's a radio, same name, and our value is small grid. So that's going to stick small grid onto our data view mode up here when it's selected. Right, so that's the structure of the switches here, or the view switches. And by doing this, what we can do is make it accessible. So if I tab to that, I can make it accessible. So when I got the focus on that, I put a focus outline on it, and I can use my arrow keys to change the view based on which view I want. So it's fully keyboard navigatable by using a radio input to do this. And I think it's a good way of doing it. My only admission here is I haven't put an ARIA label on it to tell them what each of these actually does. So I'm going to come back to that. All right. So that is the structure for the switch. Now the structure for the layout grid is here. Again, we do a UL, and I've just called this my switchable view because and you can call this whatever you like. This would be dependent on what you're building. In this demo, I've created a switchable view, or gosh, probably could have called it switchable grid, whatever you like. And it doesn't matter what it is, as long as the CSS in that is using this prefix to target what that's actually going to do. So we've got a UL, and I've got a query loop in bricks, and it is basically outputting these LIs. And on those LIs, I've created a card basic, which is one of these. And if I go to this mode here, actually, let's have a look at what's happening here. If I look at the switchable view, what we can see here in the inspector is that when I'm on a list, I can see my data view list switchable view is selected, which is actually templating. It's defaulting to this columns 1FR. Okay. When I go to my grid, the grid here, so I'm using data view mode grid, switchable view, I'm overriding my variable for columns to make it 4 columns. When I go to my small grid, I'm overriding using that selector, and I'm setting my columns to 6. That's pretty much what it is. And when we go into a, where are we? I'm going to go to my tablet, I'm going to my mobile landscape. I'm overriding that columns for the grid small to be 4. And then when I go down smaller, it's overriding it to be 2. So all we're doing is overriding a variable using the data attribute as a target. Pretty simple, right? So you can see here that once our view container has a data attribute to say what kind of view we want, we can use that anywhere within that container, within that DOM structure, to target how we want things to change when we're in that mode. So this is a kind of prelude to what you can do to change anything you like, really. It doesn't have to be a grid or a view grid. Anything you like, you can use the same thinking as use your CSS to target further down the DOM. All right, so that is the structure of that. We also have a structure of the card in here. So inside the card, we have some things changing depending on what view we're in. So when we're in the list view, we've got a small column on the left, a large one on the right. We go to this grid view here. We've got a smaller column on the left here. You know, the column structure changes. We go to the small grid list. We've got a 1FR single column view. So the card is also changing when the grids change, and that's using exactly the same method. All right, so there's our structure. Now let's look at the actual controls. So these controls here and how they work. So we start with, I've got a just a basic container, and that's just so I can align these tools to the right. And then we've got this first one here, which is a div. And on that div, I've got all my CSS for this on that div, which we'll look at a little bit later. So I'm just looking at structure at the moment. And that view switch, if we go back to our DOM, we want that view switch to be a UL, right? And this is one of the things I love about bricks. On that div there, all we do is go into custom and set it to a UL. Now we've got a UL. Everything underneath that now just works as if that's a UL. Again, all of the CSS is done on this class, so we're not going to cover that just yet. I don't set any of the settings in here, only my CSS. So if I use a lot of settings, I generally put it all into custom CSS. If I'm doing just a couple of settings, I'll just use the settings UI for that. All right, so going down to the first list item, which is our list radio input. We look at that, that's a div, but we've changed that to an li. So if we look at our DOM, that's our li there for our first item, okay? And we're going to switch simple li by just changing it to custom and setting it to li. And we've given it a BEM name of view switch __ item. Okay, and under that we've got a label. So again, it's a div. All we've done is in our custom tag, we've made that a label. All right, now we don't have to set anything on this yet. Later when we make this work for FireFox, we will have to change some attributes here, okay? But for the moment, we don't have to. Inside that, I've got a standard icon, so just a bricks icon, and all I've done is chosen the actual icon I want. I don't set the color or the font size there because they will be set with the CSS up in the view switch up here so that they're all controlled from one place. We then have an input, which again is a div, and we've just told it to be an input. And on the input, if we look at the input here, so the first input, we've got a type of radio, a name of view mode, because it's the first item, we want it to be checked if there's nothing from local storage, and we're going to value of list. If we look at the next one, on that one, we've got still the type of radio, same name, because the name on radio inputs is what links them together as a group. And this one's got a value of grid. And you guessed it, the last one will have a value of grid small, but the rest of it's the same. So the only thing that's different between these three is the first one I've got checked equals checked. So how do we do that? Let's have a look at this first one. Go to the style, go to attributes. We set our type to radio, name to view mode, check to checked for the first one, and our value to list. On our next one, down here, we go type again as radio, name, exactly the same name, so link them as a group, and our value is grid small. Actually, that's the last one, sorry. I should have gone to this one next. So that's pretty much how you set up these inputs. So I love this fact in bricks that you can change these divs or blocks or containers to be whatever DOM element you want it to be, and then you end up with a very clean, raw HTML structure here. And it just makes it a breeze to do this kind of work, which is, so Carh, you asked the question about why I said bricks is brilliant for this, and all you could see is custom code. So why is that bricks? This is why bricks is brilliant for this. It's the fact that you can do this, where you can create very simple semantic HTML structures have full access direct to the attributes, and I think it makes these sort of things so much easier to do. Okay, and the class system I think is also awesome in here as well, making these BEM classes very, very easy to manage within the editor. All right, so moving on now, so that's pretty much how those switches work, and that's the structure for those switches. We're going to look at the structure for the, so we're going to look at the JavaScript that controls. We'll come back to the actual content later. We'll just stay on these switches for now, because what we want to happen is when we switch these, we want to change the data attribute on this container up here, but we also want to save that into local storage. So if I look at my application here in local storage, I've got this view mode here, which is on grid. If I go to list, it's now changed that to list. If I go to grid small, it goes to grid small, and that's saved in my local storage. So if I refresh this page, it pulls that from local storage, and then it sets my mode up here. So we need JavaScript to do that. All right. So let's look at the JavaScript. So I've got this code down the bottom here in just a standard code block. I've put it here so that we can use it and see it. I typically wouldn't leave this kind of thing here. I typically take this out of here and stick it into a code manager for external code. Just to keep things clean, I put all of my code in one place. So it's just easier than managing it on a page-by-page basis. But let's have a look at this. I've actually copied that into a VS, where are we, VS code, so we can actually see it a little bit better. It's a little bit hard to see and go through it in here. So let's have a look at the actual code. So I'm going to go backwards for a bit here. So what we want to do, so that we can put this anywhere, we're going to wait for the DOM content to load before we initialize this code. Okay, so this can be then external, it can be an external file, it can load even before the DOM content loads if you wanted to. It doesn't matter, because we're going to wait for the DOM content before we initialize this anyway. Now when it initializes, it's going to call this function here. So it's all ES6. And first thing we're going to do is get a collection of all of the view switches. So the view switches are all of these. So all of these structures here. And that's so we can have more than one of these on the same page. Okay, whether you do that or not doesn't matter. But this allows you to have more than one of these on the page. So that's got the class of view-switch. So this function here, it's basically native JavaScript, is going to get a collection of all of those view switches and save it in switch sets. I've declared that variable at the very beginning so that it's available throughout the scope of this whole thing. And so now we've got a collection. We're going to now iterate through each of those. We're going to get a constant, or set a constant of target view container by getting the elements dataset target container. So this here in JavaScript, so dataset target container is the same as the attribute of data target. Oh. So in HTML, that is the attribute that you'll put onto the element, and this is how you read it in JavaScript. So you're looking at the data set, which takes into account that, and the rest of it is converted into camel case. So that's something you need to be aware of. So when you're setting your data target container, so if I come back to my view switch here and look at my attributes, I'm setting data target container to my main view wrapper. We look at the section here, that is main view wrapper. So we want this control to target the ID of that entire section there. Okay, so that's what that's all about there. So we get the data target container, and then we get all of the inputs for the switch items in that switch view. So that's all of these items here. And then we're going to find the inputs. Come back to this. We're going to init from storage, which is our maintaining our state. We want to iterate through each of those inputs, which is a radio input. And when it changes, we're in an ES6 function here. We're going to pull the target. The target will be the actual input that triggered the change. And we're going to call a function here to set our container view mode on the target container with the value of that input. So that is this input here, for example. If we look at the value of the input, this one is list. So if I clicked on that list input there, it's going to trigger a change. We're going to get the target, which will be that input, and we're going to get the value from that, and we're going to set that on the target container. All right. So that's all we need for multiples of these to work on the same page. All right, now heading up the page a little bit. Actually, I should have mentioned at the beginning, always put your JavaScript in a closure. A closure is this function structure here where you've got your open brackets, ES6, well, you can use it, or ES5, so you can do function brackets. Always like using ES6 and that, and then ending it with that. That is a closure which allows you to use simple names inside that because it's got its own context and it's not going to clash with any JavaScript outside of that context. So you can have multiples of these and they're not going to interfere with each other because each one of these closures has its own context. Okay, so that's just a side note. All right, now let's have a look quick through these functions here. So I've got a utility function up here to create a variable name from our view container, which will be, in our case here, we're using this section here, and we've got our ID on that section as the main view wrapper. So what we're going to do is we create a variable name using the storage container's ID, and this adding this __ view mode. If we look back in the editor here, that it's a main view wrapper __ view mode is our variable we're going to save in local storage. So we use a function so that whether we're reading or writing, we don't have to recreate this twice. All right, now setting the container view mode. So we get our view container in the mode, right? We get our variable name from that utility function there. And all we're doing on the view container, data set view mode equals mode, which basically gives us this. So whatever that mode is, so it's list, grid, or small grid, it's setting that on the view container. And then what we're going to do is in our local storage, this is for our state, we want to set the item on the variable name to that same mode. So that gives us this here. All right, now this little bit here is a little tricky because we're applying, I'll come back to this when I show you the CSS, because we're using the same animation for every time I click on one of these. I'm just getting this slight fade in up animation. We're using the same animation. If you apply the same animation in CSS to element, the same element, it will not re-trigger that animation. It has to be a different animation, or you have to add or remove a class or something. So what we need to do is trigger a reflow in the browser so that it reanimates, and that's what this here is for. I'm just adding or removing an animate class from the container using a set timeout and adding the animate back, and you'll notice in the set timeout I've got no delay, which is really interesting. So this is an interesting thing with JavaScript in the browser. If you just do this, if you just copy that and put it there, so if you go remove it and then add it, it doesn't work. It does not trigger anything. But if you do a set timeout and then stick that in the timeout without any delay whatsoever, it triggers a reflow. And I think the reason is because the set timeout pushes the execution of this further down the execution list. So it'll execute once the last, I guess, thread of JavaScript is actually run. So somehow it works if you do this. So you remove, set timeout, re-add, and that you can use that to re-trigger your animation. All right, so then we've got the init from storage. So this is basically up here when we set the container mode. we're setting to local storage the variable name to whatever that mode is. But when we load the page, when we get down to our init, our browser reload, or our first page visit, we want to init from storage for this container. So the init from storage is basically going to get our variable name from the function we created up here. And it's going to try and get that item from the storage, so use that variable name. It may be the first time you visited this page, so it may not exist in local storage. So what it's going to do, if it doesn't exist, it doesn't do anything. If it does exist, we're going to set the container mode using the view container and stored value. So just to reset it, we're then going to select or find the element that should be checked, and then we're going to just fire off the click on that. So that is, what happens is that when we see we're on this grid small at the moment, if I do a refresh here, what needs to happen is it needs to find, okay, which one of these has the value small grid, and then click it to select it. If we don't do that, it's just going to stay. Even though this will be on the small grid view, it'll look like where our list view is selected because we haven't told it which one to check. I mean, there's other ways of doing this, but I just thought that was the easiest way for me to do it. So that is what that does. So that's all of the JavaScript explained. Hopefully that wasn't too difficult, but in a nutshell, wait for the DOM content to load, initialize, get all of our view switches, or sets of view switches, iterate through all of those, initialize them from the container, add listeners to all the inputs on each of those so that we can trigger a update when the input is changed, and using the change, not click, so then we can use our arrows, arrow keys on our keyboard to change as well, and it works beautifully. Okay, so that's the JavaScript explained. All right, now this is a lot to go through, isn't it? So sorry guys if I've lost you on any of this. Now, the grid, let's have a look at the grid structure. So this grid structure here is a single grid. So if we look at the builder, I'm just going to collapse my tools. Again, I've just got a container just to wrap this. Here's my switchable content. Probably could give that a better name. We'll call that switchable grid. Makes more sense, doesn't it? And we're going to put all our CSS again on this. And if we look at the list item, it is a query loop. So we're just using a query loop, and we're just querying all of the posts. And these are just faker press posts. We then have a card basic. I've just created a card basic block bin name. And on that card basic, we have a image. And I've done that as a wrapper so we can color it, color the background. We've just got an image inside it. We've got a card basic container for our content. I think we'll call it content wrapper. And we just got a heading and some basic text in there. And the basic text, so the heading is our post title. The basic text is our post excerpt. All right, and that's the basic structure that we've got there. So let's have a look at the list item itself. So go back to the switchable grid. On the switchable grid, again, we make it a UL because we want screen readers to get to this and go, here is a list of items and there's 50 items or whatever. Item number 1 is blah, blah, blah. So we want the screen reader to recognize this as well. So that's the reason we use the UL. And so basically we set that to a UL and put all our CSS on there, which we'll come back to. Okay. We then go to a list item, which in the content, we set that to an li, and we set it to a query loop. And that's all we're doing on this. We're not actually adding anything to the styles. We're not doing anything in here at all. It's just a li with a query loop. All right. And then we've got the cards, which actually, what I'll do is I'll come back to the cards because we'll look at the switching of the grid between the list grid and small grid first. Okay, so looking at the grid CSS here, we've got a couple of variables. If you're using a framework, you might use your framework variables here. I'm just setting it to 15 pixels just so it's transferable to you guys to use. We're then setting our display to grid template columns to our variable of the columns. We could do this in the settings UI, but because we've got so much CSS, it makes more sense for me to have it all in the one place in this custom CSS. So we're going to line our items to stretch to make things full height. And we're going to have a gap of our variable gap up here. Because we're doing a UL, we want to get rid of the margin and the padding and set our list style type to none. All right. Now, here's where the magic happens for the grid. So if we go back to the structure here, we're saying on the section up here, we're changing this data view mode here to whatever mode that is. So now in the CSS, what we can do is go, when we're on data view mode of list, set our columns to 1FR. When we're on our data view mode of grid, set our columns to repeat 4. And we're on grid small, set it to repeat 6. Okay, we've got some animation stuff down here, which we'll talk about shortly. Okay, so that there is what controls whether we switch between 1 column, 4 columns, or 6 columns. Okay, how simple is that? So once your JavaScript and your controller is ready, anything you want to control the view, all we have to do is prefix with these attributes. All right, now then we got to look at how do we make this responsive. So when we go to other sites, so for example on that small grid, on mobile view, we've got 2 columns. On tablet view, we've got 4 columns. On desktop view, we've got 6 columns. How do we do that? The easiest way to do this, I'm going to show you in Bricks itself, is here is our CSS. All you do is switch your mode here. Let's go, I think I've done type mobile, landscape, and portrait. So you switch to your landscape and you just override those. So we just change the property that we had here. So these 2 here, we just copy those, or these 3 if you want. So just copy those, paste them into there, and then we change the columns variable. And then we go to our mobile portrait, copy and paste those into there, and then just change our columns variables. That's all we have to do. And that gives us our fully responsive grid here, and we can control it on each of these modes. How amazing is that? That is so easy to do that I think it's a no-brainer. Anyway, so with these controls, now we know the structure of those controls. Let's have a look at the CSS that we've got for that. So let's head over to the CSS, which I'll put into a VS Code box again. It's actually, if I look in the Bricks Builder and we look at our controls, the CSS here for the view switch. So this CSS here, I'm just going to put that into a VS Code box so we can see it a bit better. So we create some variables. If you're using a framework, you might change these to reference the variables in the framework. And what we're looking at here is we want a gap. So that's the gap between these items here. We want a font size. We're using a icon font. So the font size will control the size of these icons. This is what, when we put these icons onto the editor, we don't set the color or the size because we're going to do that through these variables here. The outline color, that's for when it's focused, and that will be again using a reference to your framework or whichever you use for controlling that. And same with these unselected and selected color. So these are just straight variables. Now, because again, this is a UL, we want to get rid of all of the padding, margin, and the list style. So get rid of those. We set our display to flex, direction to column, direction to row, and our gap to gap. And then we can lay these 3 things out in a row there. Okay, and that's all there is to that. On the items, which is these here, the allies, I don't think we need this actually. Let's just get rid of that. I don't think we need that because it's I think I'll put that there when I was playing around with it. So we don't need that. So then we've got a focus within. What focus within does is that if any one of these inputs inside that parent is focused, then that condition is true. So we're looking at our switch. If any input inside it has got focus, we're going to set the outline to 1 pixel solid with our outline color. And that gives us this, when we tab to it, it gives us this outline here. Okay? If you don't want the outline, don't put it there. And then we're going to set our font size. So we're using a font icon for our label icons. So we select the I element on the root, and we're going to set our font size to the font size up here. The label, by default, we want it to be our unselected color. Display flex. This is a strange thing with these icons, with the labels. If you don't have them on flex, you get it's like about a 5 pixel something at the bottom. It doesn't look like margin or padding. I'm not sure why it does that when it's a block, but changing it to flex resolves the problem. Set it to a pointer, get rid of the margin and the padding. Okay, super simple. Now, because we're restyling an input, these are radio inputs, which would normally be a circle with a dot in them. We don't want to see that. We just want to see these icons, which is the label. And unfortunately, there's no common way to remove that with browsers. Different browsers work differently. So what we're going to do is we're going to use these two here for general browsers, and on iOS less than 15, we just have to set the background color to white because you can't hide it. Okay, set our margin, padding, and border to 0, and set our opacity to 0. This isn't needed in the editor. It just shows up for whatever reason. No matter what you do here in the editor, it just shows up, and I don't know why. It actually doesn't show the full input, but or input style, but it messes things up in your editor. Now, then we've got the structure. Now, I've got a note here. I'll talk about the FireFox issue. Now, with labels and inputs, there's two ways you can actually structure these. You can put a label, and then you can wrap an input in that. So here's the actual label. In our case, it'll be an icon, and then you've got your input. And that links the label to the input. The other way you do it is you have a label and an input as siblings. You give your input a unique ID, and then you tell your label it's for that ID. Now, unfortunately, because of the way FireFox works, we're going to have to change our code to use this method. Now, the reason I wanted to use this method is because then we could copy and paste that switch to elsewhere, and we don't have to worry about the IDs on those inputs. Because of the way FireFox works, if we copy and paste that switch to somewhere else, we have to then go through and edit those IDs so that they don't clash with each other. So this is the ideal way of doing it, which is why I'm showing you in this demo. That's the ideal way of it. Unfortunately, this is the way we're going to have to do it so that it works with FireFox. And that's because FireFox does not have a has selector. Okay, so in FireFox, what we have to do is put these side by side and then have a look at if our view switch item label is preceded as a sibling that's got input checked, we're going to set the color, the selected color. Okay, so that's pretty much what we have to do to make it work in FireFox. And then there's just a few things in here just to tidy up in the editor, because there's some things in the Bricks editor to make things visible that mess up our design when we don't want it to. So that's the CSS for that. All right. Now, hopefully that's covered enough. I'm going to look at now how we make this work in FireFox. All right. So in FireFox, what we have to do, we have to change the way that our switches work. Okay, so this here, we've got a label, and then we've got a switch. What we have to do is take our input outside of the label. Let's put the label on top of it. Oh, I love this drag and drop. So we're going to change the way these work. Where are we? The next one. Okay. So So we're going to change the way these work. So we're going to have a different structure. We're going to have a label with a sibling input. Let's put that above there. This is a label, then input. Okay. So don't worry about what's inside those labels. So this is our structure that we need for it to work in Firefox. We need to go label and then input. Now, unfortunately, because of this, we have to link these two together. So what we have to do is on our first input here, we need to give that an attribute, or ID, here. So we're going to call this our view mode list. Okay, so I'm going to copy that CSS ID from there. And on my label, I have to go into my attributes. And I have to add a 4 and put my ID there. Now let's do the same on this one over here. So view, what do I call those? Instance input here. I need to go to the CSS ID grid. And on my label, add a 4. Grid. Next one. Label. Okay. Let's save that. I'm not sure if I've made my CSS correct for this yet. Let's have a look. See if that's working. It's not working. Let's have a look at why. Sorry guys, I messed up there. The order of these. So because I want the label to change color, the label has to be the last part. So it needs to be the input checked followed by the label, not the other way around. Which means we just need to change the structure here. So we put the input above the label on each of these. And now what you find is that this will work in Firefox. If I do an F5 here, we now have the switch working in Firefox with the color. And we also have that working in Chrome. And it's working correctly in both. Okay, so that's the structure we need for Firefox. We just need to make sure that the we link the label and the input together, and we use this type of CSS to target it rather than the label has. And the reason for that is because Firefox doesn't have a has selector. All right, so there was one thing I forgot to mention in the CSS for the animation, I think, of the grid. Yes, here we go. So if we head back to the JavaScript code, in the content here, you'll note that remember that I noted that we have this here. So we basically got to remove the animate, set a timeout, and add the animate to trigger a reflow. Now the reason for that is that we've got a data view mode animate root, so that's our element. We want to set the animation to fade up small. We want to go from opacity of 0, translate 20 pixels down, to opacity of 1, translate Y back to 0. Now, I tried adding animations to these here, but because the animation is the same animation regardless of what the mode is, it doesn't reanimate. So what I decided to do is look at this whole container when it's got a data view mode on it, and then the animate class will be added and removed, or sorry, removed and then added. So this will re-trigger it. So if we go the view container, basically, when it's got the animate class for our element, which would be our grid, we want to trigger this animation. So what that does is when the JavaScript here removes and re-adds the animate, that causes this to re-trigger. So that's the reason we did that. All right, so the last thing we want to look at is how the card changes when we animate. So what we'll see with our cards is in the list view, we've got the full excerpt here with the ellipsis at the end of it. So regardless of how long it is, so that's obviously a small amount, that's got the full amount. What we want to do is when we go to our grid view, I want to cap that at 4 lines. Sorry, 6 lines. So we've got 6 lines of content, and then we've got our ellipsis. When we go to our small grid view, I want to cap that at 3 lines with the ellipsis. The other thing that's happening here is if we look at our list view, we've got a column here, which is, I think, 1FR, 6FR, I think. And then we go to this view, I think it's 1FR, 4FR, or 3FR. And then when we go to this view here, it's just 1 column. So we need to change the card to layout depending on what's happening with our grid as well. So how do we do that? Very, very simply. So I showed you previously how all we have to do is use this prefix here to change the way things work. So if we look at the card itself, here's our card, basic. We've got CSS on that. And let's look at the CSS. I think I've also copied this to, yes, I have copied this to the card. Yeah, put this into VS Code so we can see it better. So I'm setting up a standard gap, standard columns of 1FR, and a display of grid. Sorry, we haven't got the card CSS there at all. Let's have a look at the card CSS. Helps if I put the right CSS there. Okay, so we've got a gap of 2 rem. Card columns by default is 1FR, 5FR, and our image rammer background is a slight grey. All right, so in our root for our card, we're going to set the display to grid, gap, template columns, set to that variable. So that's the 1FR, 5FR by default. So that is 1FR, 5FR. All right. Set our height to 100% so it fills the container, and align items to stretch. That's pretty straightforward, right? And with our card image wrapper, I'm setting my background color to be the background that we set up here. The reason for that is with these, see how this image is nice and small, but we've got this gray background here, which shows the background of that image wrapper on that column. Okay. And again, we're using our targeting the same as we did with these here. We're just basically looking for when our data mode is, data view mode is grid. On our root element, we want to set our columns to 1FR, 3FR. Okay, so we're going from 1FR, 5FR to 1FR, 3FR. So 1FR, 5FR there, 1FR, 3FR there. And then when we're on grid small, we would just want to go to 1 column. So 1FR. There we go, 1FR. Pretty simple. It's exactly the same as what we did with the grid layout for all of the items. We're doing the same thing in the card itself. All right, now the clamping of this to lines. So our grid, we've got 6 lines. On our grid small, we've got 3 lines. Same deal again. Data view mode grid, target our root, look at our card basic content wrapper. We want to clamp the bricks text basic elements. So in our structure here, what we've done is we put a basic wrapper. Here's our basic text, which is a bricks basic text wrapper. Okay, in there we're just using our standard CSS to clamp to 6, and when it's on the grid small, we're using our standard CSS to clamp to 3. All right, so I think what you're seeing here is that it's by having this system where these switches here changed a data attribute on a parent container, so on the main view container we can use this anywhere we like. So we can have multiple things in this view container, and in this case we've got a layout grid for our items, and then within that layout grid we've got a card, and we can use the same attribute here to decide how we're going to display the grids for those cards when we're in that mode, and how we're going to display the actual grid itself when we're in that mode, of grid items. So I think it's a really cool way of doing it. So anyway, that is it for me. I hope you like this. I'm going to chuck a what I'm going to do is I'll export this template so you've got something to start with. I'll chuck a link to it so you can play with it. Good luck, and I hope you enjoy this. Thank you.